Take a breath right now. Go on. In through the nose. If you're in a bedroom, a bathroom, a car, an office, there's a good chance that breath just carried a little burst of lavender, or vanilla, or ocean breeze, or cotton fresh linen. Something with a name that sounds like a candle at a spa. Something that made the room smell clean. Here's the problem. It didn't make the room clean. It made the room smell like your idea of clean. And underneath that smell, something else was happening, something almost nobody thinks about, something the bottle will never tell you, because in most countries, it's legally allowed to hide it. This is the story of what's actually inside that spray, that plug-in, that little gel disc sitting on your shelf, and why the very chemistry that makes a room smell fresh is the same chemistry that, under the wrong conditions, can quietly poison the air you breathe. We treat scent as a signal of cleanliness. It's almost automatic. Walk into a hotel room that smells like citrus and cotton, and your brain files it away as clean before you've even looked at the sheets. Walk into a spotless room with no smell at all, and something in the back of your mind hesitates, like cleanliness needs a scent to be believed. Advertisers have understood this for decades. That's exactly why the industry sells you plug-ins, sprays, gels, and beads shaped like little scent bombs, promising 24-hour freshness, as if freshness were something you could bottle and release on a timer. But smell and cleanliness are not the same thing. One is a chemical signal reaching a receptor in your nose. The other is the actual absence of dirt, bacteria, and pollutants. An air freshener does nothing to the second. It only manufactures the first. But to understand why an air freshener can kill you, you first need to understand what fragrance actually is. Because most people assume fragrance is basically perfume, a nice smell, maybe a little strong, mostly harmless. That's not what it is. Not exactly. Fragrance is a mixture, not of one ingredient, but sometimes dozens, sometimes over 100 different chemical compounds blended together to create a single scent. And most of those compounds belong to a category called volatile organic compounds, VOCs. Volatile means they evaporate easily at room temperature. That's the entire mechanism of an air freshener. It works by constantly releasing these volatile compounds into the air so you keep smelling them. The moment it stops evaporating, it stops working. So by design, an air freshener's job is to keep pumping chemicals into the air you're breathing for as long as it's plugged in or sitting open. Now, on its own, that might sound manageable. Lots of things evaporate. Water evaporates. And nobody's worried about that. The real problem isn't that these compounds exist in the air. The real problem is what happens to them once they're there. Indoor air isn't empty space. It already contains trace amounts of ozone, from sunlight coming through windows, from printers, from outdoor air that drifts in when you open a door. And here's where the chemistry turns against you. Certain VOCs found overwhelmingly in fragranced products, terpenes like limonene and pinene, the compounds that give things a citrus or pine smell, react with that ambient ozone. And when they react, they don't just disappear. They transform into new compounds. Secondary pollutants. And one of the most common byproducts of that reaction is formaldehyde. Formaldehyde, a compound classified as a probable human carcinogen, something you did not spray into the air, something your air freshener created after the fact, invisibly through a chemical reaction happening in the space around your head while you sleep, while you drive, while you sit at your desk. And formaldehyde isn't the only thing produced. That same reaction generates something called ultrafine particles, Particles so small they can travel deep into your lungs, small enough in some cases to cross into your bloodstream. Ultrafine particles have been linked to cardiovascular strain and respiratory disease. None of this is on the label. None of this is what you were expecting when you clicked Add to Cart on a scent called Morning Meadow. So here's the number that should genuinely change how you think about that plug-in on your wall. Researchers studying electric air fresheners found that, used alone in a home, they can push formaldehyde exposure to roughly 17% of what's called the critical exposure limit, the threshold regulators use to define a meaningfully hazardous dose. 17% from one plug-in on its own. Now add in the other products already sitting in most homes: an all-purpose cleaner, a floor polish, a laundry product with its own fragrance, all things releasing the same class of compounds. Combine them, and that number can climb to roughly 34% of the critical exposure limit in as little as 30 minutes. That's not a worst-case industrial accident scenario. That's a normal Tuesday. Cleaning the kitchen, spraying the bathroom, running a plug-in in the bedroom, all before lunch. And here is the part that should really unsettle you. For certain hazardous air pollutants, the category formaldehyde and several other fragrance byproducts fall into. The Environmental Protection Agency doesn't define a safe amount at all. Not a low amount, not a cautious amount. No safe exposure level. The assumption baked into the regulation itself is that any exposure carries some risk, and the only variable is how much. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but this is probably a handful of cheap, sketchy products. Surely the well-known brands, the natural ones, the ones that advertise essential oils instead of chemicals, are fine. This is the part of the story that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time, because it's not what the marketing wants you to believe. When researchers directly compared air fresheners labeled organic, green, or all-natural against ordinary fragranced products, they found no meaningful difference in the emission of hazardous pollutants. None. An essential oil is still, chemically, a concentrated source of terpenes, the exact compounds that react with ozone to generate formaldehyde and ultrafine particles in the first place. Natural doesn't mean the ozone reaction stops happening. It means the marketing changed. The chemistry didn't. And there's a second layer to this that makes it worse. In one nationwide product test, researchers examined more than a dozen popular air fresheners and found that the overwhelming majority, well over 80%, contained at least one chemical classified as hazardous. In a broader analysis of the volatile compounds actually detected across fragranced products, researchers identified over 100 distinct VOCs. Almost none of them appeared on the product label. Almost none of them appeared on the manufacturer's own safety documentation. Because in most jurisdictions, the specific chemical recipe of a fragrance is protected as a trade secret. Companies are legally permitted to write the single word fragrance on a label and disclose nothing else. Not because the ingredients are harmless, because the formula is treated as proprietary information, the same legal category as a soda company protecting its syrup recipe. So when you breathe in a room that smells like a spa, you are, in a very literal sense, inhaling a mixture whose exact contents even the regulators studying it can't fully identify from the packaging. Think about how unusual that actually is. Food has to list its ingredients, down to the additive. Medication has to list its ingredients, down to the milligram. But a can of air freshener sitting on the same shelf as your food, in the same house where your children breathe, can legally list a single word, fragrance, and stop there. Not because anyone proved those ingredients were safe to withhold, because the law simply never required them to be shown in the first place. That gap between what's legally required and what's actually in the can is where this entire problem lives. Now let's talk about who actually pays the price for this, because the effects aren't evenly distributed. For most healthy adults in well-ventilated spaces, brief exposure produces mild symptoms, if any. Some eye or throat irritation, maybe a headache, gone once the air clears. But push the conditions in a specific direction, and the risk climbs sharply. Small, poorly ventilated rooms concentrate these compounds instead of dispersing them. A bathroom with a plug-in and the door shut. A car with a hanging air freshener and the windows up, especially parked in the sun, where heat accelerates the release of VOCs and speeds up the ozone reaction that produces formaldehyde. A bedroom with a diffuser running all night while you sleep for 8 straight hours in the same recycled air. Think about the car specifically for a second, because it's almost a perfect storm of every risk factor at once. It's a small, sealed volume of air to begin with. It sits in direct sun for hours, and heat doesn't just make a car uncomfortable. It accelerates the evaporation rate of VOCs and speeds up the exact ozone reaction that produces formaldehyde. Studies analyzing car air fresheners specifically have found that every single product tested emitted at least one VOC classified as potentially hazardous, with the same terpene and ozone chemistry driving the same secondary pollutants found in home products. Now put a person in that car for a daily commute, windows up, freshener swinging from the mirror, year after year. That's not an isolated exposure. That's a routine one. Children are more vulnerable because their airways are smaller and their breathing rate relative to body size is higher, meaning they absorb proportionally more of whatever is in the air per pound of body weight. Researchers studying fragrance sensitivity have documented children experiencing seizures after exposure to heavily scented products, and adults with chemical sensitivities losing consciousness near air fresheners in enclosed spaces. Elderly people, and anyone with asthma or an existing respiratory condition, sit in the same higher risk category. Their margin for tolerating airway irritation and inflammation is simply smaller to begin with. Public health surveys back this up at a population level. Across separate national surveys, roughly 1 in 5 people reported some kind of health problem they directly attributed to air fresheners: irritation, headaches, breathing difficulty. That's not a fringe complaint. That's a fifth of the population noticing something, and in most cases, having no idea why, because the ingredient responsible was never listed anywhere they could see it. So here's the actual picture, once you put all of it together. An air freshener is not designed to clean your air. It's designed to mask what's already there by adding a stronger, more pleasant-smelling layer of chemicals on top of it. Those chemicals are, by design, volatile, meaning they're built to keep evaporating into the room, into your lungs, for as long as the product keeps working. Some of those chemicals react with the ozone already present indoors and produce secondary pollutants, formaldehyde, ultrafine particles, that were never sprayed, never disclosed, and never intended to be inhaled, but exist anyway, invisibly, as a direct byproduct of the fragrance doing its job. And the industry producing these products operates under a regulatory loophole that allows the specific recipe to remain undisclosed, indefinitely, under the single word fragrance. None of this means every plug-in is a medical emergency waiting to happen. Most exposures are low-grade, chronic, cumulative rather than acute, closer to the slow erosion of indoor air quality than a single dramatic event. But low-grade and chronic is exactly the kind of risk that's easiest to ignore, because there's no single moment where something visibly goes wrong. There's just a bathroom that always smells like vanilla, a car that always smells like pine, a bedroom that runs a diffuser every night for years, quietly keeping formaldehyde and ultrafine particles a permanent, undisclosed feature of the air in that room. The wet bulb temperature story is about a threshold you cross suddenly, where physics simply stops working in your favor. This is different. This is about a threshold you cross slowly. One spray, one plug-in, one fresh linen scented candle at a time, in the exact rooms you spend the most hours of your life inside. The bedroom where you sleep a third of your life away. The bathroom you enter dozens of times a day. The car that carries you back and forth every single morning. None of this requires panic. It requires ventilation, awareness, and a willingness to ask what fragrance is actually hiding. Opening a window while a plug-in runs. Choosing an unscented cleaning product where one exists. Not assuming that a candle labeled natural is somehow exempt from the same ozone chemistry as everything else on the shelf. Small choices, repeated daily, in the rooms where repetition is exactly what turns a low-grade exposure into a lifelong one. So next time you walk into your bathroom, or get into your car, or plug something into the wall because the room needs to smell like something other than itself, you now know what's actually happening in that air. Not a clean room, a chemical reaction running quietly, exactly where you breathe the deepest and the longest.